it's amazing that the Brazilian left cheered the CIA from doing this. The Supreme Court banned supporters of Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro himself from pointing out that Lula was convicted of a crime. He was convicted of a crime. They were barred from saying that Lula had friendly relations with Nicaragua and Venezuela, even though he did. So a lot of statements that were at least politically viable, if not factually true, the Supreme Court banned the Bolsonaro movement from saying it. One of the issues that we have tried to cover that is not often very covered is not just the censorship regime being implemented in the United States, but also the way in which it's connected to censorship regimes in the rest of the democratic world. The way in which the EU has adopted a new law called the Digital Services Act, or the UK has adopted the Online Safety Act, or Canada has adopted several different provisions that allow them to control the flow of information on the internet and to criminalize or to punish people who allow the flow of information that they dislike. And so we've covered the developments in those countries, but also in Brazil, in part because we're here in Brazil, but also because Brazil is a very important country. It's the second largest in the hemisphere, the sixth largest country in the world. It has bigger oil reserves than a lot of Middle Eastern countries. It has the world's most important and valuable environmental asset in the Amazon. There's all kinds of commodities and important metals, including iron. And I think that's important to note because I think a lot of times people hear about the CIA role, the involvement in the country, and people really don't believe it. So here from Reuters in May of 2023, exclusive, the CIA chief told the Bolsonaro government not to mess with Brazil's elections, sources say. Now, here's some more detail. It came from the Financial Times in June of 2023. Quote, "The discreet U.S. campaign to defend Brazil's election. Amid widespread speculation about a coup attempt, the Biden administration pressured politicians and generals to respect the result. CIA Chief William Burns also came and told the Bolsonaro administration not to mess with the elections. Quote, the Secretary of Defense, the head of the CIA, the National Security Advisor, all visited an election year, said McKinley. Now, this is coming from the Biden administration, and they were saying, look, all we were doing was going there to try and make sure that the election was legitimate. We were protecting democracy. That's what the CIA has said forever. And it's amazing that the Brazilian left cheered the CIA from doing this because Brazil has a very sensitive history with the United States. It was the CIA and the US government in 1964 that helped right-wing generals in Brazil overthrow the democratically elected government. And it resulted in a 21-year military dictatorship in Brazil that the United States and the UK supported. So you would think when Brazilian leftists hear that the CIA is coming to Brazil to pass messages about the election, they would say, stay out of our country. They were thrilled about this because they knew the Biden administration wanted Lula to win, which is not surprising. He's much more ideologically aligned with President Biden, and Bolsonaro was more aligned with Trump. And so you have all the top national security officials from the Biden administration, including the head of the CIA, coming to Brazil during an election year to repeatedly meet with top Brazilian officials about the election. And of course, the United States government is going to say, oh, we were just going there to protect the integrity of the election. But knowing that they wanted Lula to win and that they were constantly coming here and meeting with these officials is the kind of thing that people ordinarily are against, especially on the left, unless they're convinced, as they were here, that the CIA and other Biden officials were here to do what they could to ensure that Lula won. Now, here's the tweet that Tucker posted to introduce the segment. He said, quote, the Biden administration helped install a pro-Chinese government in Brazil, which immediately shut down opposition media and began arresting dissidents. Here are two of its victims. Now, that is not a framing that I'm comfortable with, even though I'm very happy Tucker did this interview, and I'll explain why. I don't see things quite that way, but I'm just going to give you the first minute or so of Tucker's kind of introduction to this so that you can get a better sense, again, of the kind of perspective he was presenting.
A little less than 2 years ago, we went to Brazil to cover the presidential election then in progress. The incumbent, President Jair Bolsonaro, was running against a former president, a convicted felon, who's very close to the government of China, called Lula. And as you wandered around the country, went to its biggest cities, you really got the feeling if this election goes to Lula, this place is going to, in very short order, become a police state People are going to go to jail. Democracy is going to end. The media will no longer be able to report honestly and openly, and the Chinese government will have undue influence over.
All right, so let me just stop there and say a couple things. This regime of attack and erosion of rights began long before Lula was elected. It was already in place when Tucker was in Brazil and Jair Bolsonaro was president. In fact, Tucker interviewed me in a hotel room in Rio de Janeiro where I was talking about the severe attacks on free speech rights imposed by the Brazilian Supreme Court. And as for being close to China, the reality is that China has expanded massively, both in terms of its economy and its relationship and trade relationship with other countries. And China began buying a huge amount of commodities and other products from Brazil and selling to Brazil as well. And so China became the largest trading partner of Brazil. It's a capitalistic relationship. So this idea that China has infiltrated Brazil, that China was doing fine in Brazil under Bolsonaro. It was also the #1 trading partner of Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro. China is an important country to Brazil financially and economically and has been for many years. I would not suggest that China is a player in these events. I think it's much more domestic than anything, although it is true that the United States government, the Biden administration, did dispatch many diplomats and the CIA throughout the 2022 election under the guise of telling Bolsonaro that they would not accept any claims of voter fraud, any attempts at a coup, but clearly the Biden administration wanted Lula to win. They were much closer to Lula ideologically. That is also a fact. Now, let me just finish the rest of Tucker's commentary here.
Brazil, and that's a big deal, not just for Brazilians, but for the United States, because Brazil is the most significant country in the Americas after this one. It's huge. It's got enormous natural resources. It's got a well-educated population. There's a lot in Brazil. And so if it descends into darkness, that's a problem not just for Brazil, but for every country in this hemisphere. So the question is, 2.5 years later, a year and a half later, rather, what happened in Brazil? Lula won in an election that was very obviously rigged.
No, when he says it was an election very obviously rigged, I don't know if he means by that the vote count was fraudulent, because I don't think there's much evidence for that. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but there's no evidence that I've seen convincing that it did. Or if he means by rigged the kind of rigging that was done in the United States with the media entirely aligned in favor of Lula, which was absolutely true, with the Bolsonaro movement being constantly censored. The Supreme Court banned supporters of Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro himself from pointing out that Lula was convicted of a crime. He was convicted of a crime, a conviction that ended up being nullified in part because of the reporting that we did that showed his prosecutor was convicted, but he was corrupt, but he was still convicted. They were barred from saying that Lula had friendly relations with Nicaragua and Venezuela, even though he did. So a lot of statements that were at least politically viable, if not factually true, the Supreme Court banned the Bolsonaro movement from saying it. So if that's what he means by rigged, I'm comfortable with that word.